When The Phantom of the Opera finally closes on Broadway after an unprecedented 35-year run, we won't only be losing Andrew Lloyd Webber's music or Maria Bjornsson's scenic designs. One of the unintended consequences of Phantom's gargantuan run has been the chance for an entire generation of artists and audiences to watch a production of a musical directed by Hal Prince. An unparalleled legend of a director and producer who passed away in 2019, Prince left behind a considerable legacy of shaping the 20th century theater landscape. While many of the shows he directed the premieres of have since returned to Broadway in revivals by different directors, Phantom remained, for many years, the final chance for enterprising historians to see a production that Prince himself had staged, even 4 decades after it debuted. At least until April 16th, when the last living remnant of Prince's directing work will close. On Broadway, at least. It's still running on the West End. But for as unimpeachable as Hal Prince is considered today, there was a time period when public perception began to turn on him. From 1981 to 1985, Prince directed 4 Broadway flops in a row, each of which had its failure pinned, for one reason or another, on the director. Of these, 2 are newly relevant in 2023. The first is Merrily We Roll Along, which will return to Broadway in triumph this fall after a 40-year campaign to prove the critics wrong. But the second is relevant only because it was a musical adaptation of a play that has, by sheer coincidence, returned to Broadway just as Phantom is closing. The play in question is the current revival of Ibsen's A Doll's House, and the flop in question is the 1982 musical A Doll's Life. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you may be thinking that I already discussed A Doll's Life, and yes, I did. In 2019, I kicked off this channel with a series of 6 videos discussing unknown musical adaptations of well-known source material, including Breakfast at Tiffany's and Raisin. Those videos are still up if you can handle my inability to audio balance and the various factual errors. Episode 5 of that series covered A Doll's Life, but in revisiting the script now, I've developed a much more nuanced take on it than I had 4 years ago. And, more significantly, now I can make an essay with audio that doesn't sound like it's underwater.
When deciding what musicals should be included in this web series, the best candidates are always the musicals whose rehearsal teams sound like Mad Libs.
So that video has been privated, and in its place, I am releasing this remastered look at the show. As we say goodbye to Hal Prince's final Broadway success, let's reconsider the failure of A Doll's Life, a musical that was ahead of its time, but not in the way it wanted to be. Although Hal Prince is instrumental to this story, the idea of A Doll's Life didn't originate with him, but with the legendary writing duo of Betty Comden and Adolph Green. By the late 80s, they'd already cemented their place in theater history with musicals like On the Town, Peter Pan, Bells a Ringing, and Wonderful Town, along with the screenplay to Singin' in the Rain. Now, despite their names being linked in theater history, they weren't linked off stage. Comden and Green were both married to other people, and in Betty Comden's case, she had the enormous good fortune to marry a man who was fully supportive of her creative endeavors with Green. For more than 60 years, Comden's artistic work made her the breadwinner of her family, an arrangement that was unusual in the 1950s, but by the 80s had become slightly more common. With the rise of second-wave feminism in America, combined with a turbulent economy as the post-war boom trickled off, more and more women were building lives that were financially independent of partners or families. However, it wasn't always easy for women to do so, a privilege not lost on Comden. As she said in a 1982 interview, "I have had a career all my life. I've also been married, had children. But the fact that I had a wonderful thing doesn't mean I wasn't aware of what it's like for others." Coincidentally, one of the theater's most famous stories about a woman fighting for her autonomy had just celebrated its centennial in 1979. A Doll's House, a play by the Norwegian dramatist Heinrich Ibsen, has long been considered a seminal classic. The story of a wife, Nora Helmer, coming into the realization that her marriage to her husband Torvald will never be equal, so long as he sees her as only an accessory and not as a full person. Over the course of the play, as Nora attempts to hide from Torvald that she illegally forged her father's signature, she becomes more and more suffocated by the life that has been built around her, until she decides that continuing that life is impossible. Following a climax in which Torvald first chastises her for the forgery, but immediately recants when the consequences of her her actions are alleviated, Nora eschews the happy ending audiences in 1879 would have expected, walking out on her husband with a famous slam of the door. The play was in the zeitgeist throughout the 1970s, with twin film adaptations releasing in 1973, starring Jane Fonda and Claire Bloom, as well as a limited-run Broadway revival in 1975, starring Liv Ullmann. Comden and Green, considering ideas for their next musical after the successful On the 20th Century, began discussing what a potential sequel to Ibsen's play might look like, and whether the material might be suitable for their next project, to take them further afield from the musical comedy mold they were known for. In a 1980 discussion with Hal Prince, who had directed On the 20th Century, Prince had taken to the idea of a Doll's House sequel, and encouraged the pair to begin writing. A year later, one day after the ignoble closure of Prince's first major flop, Merrily We Roll Along, he went into a meeting with Comden and Green to discuss bringing A Doll's Life, as the project would be called, into production. While Comden and Green would write the book and lyrics, it was Prince that suggested composer Larry Grossman as their collaborator. Grossman's few successes included the musicals Snoopy and Good Time Charlie, although his most notable project was Minnie's Boys, a fictional biomusical about the Marx Brothers which, despite its brief Broadway run, had caught Prince's attention. The trio had created a concept for the musical, which Prince began editing in order to bring it closer to his style. See, Prince was intrigued by the Ibsen play, but was concerned that a musical adaptation of it would end up too naturalistic. As a way of imbuing the project with the poetry that abstraction brings, as he put it, Prince contributed two lenses to the production. The musical would begin with a modern dress company rehearsing Ibsen's play, before flashing back to the 1870s during the opening number. However, the ensemble in modern dress would remain visible during the show, commenting on the action like a Greek chorus. In addition, Prince took inspiration from another Norwegian artist, the painter Edvard Munch. Prince felt Munch's colors were severe and swirling, the colors of crisis. The painter Munch and Ibsen shared obsessive relationships with women, Prince said. The thing about Munch and Ibsen is there's that incredible love of women, but it has a dark side. The Munch figures inform Tom O'Brien's and Tazina Firth's lavish settings and provide another, more severe level from which the audience is able to look in on Nora's education. In particular, the painting The Dance of Life ended up directly inspiring the piece, when Prince added a silent quartet of dancers dressed like Munch's figures, who would dance through the musical to symbolize Nora's turning mind. Now, two quick things. Firstly, it's unclear whether Prince knew this, but the selection of Munch was hugely apropos considering that Munch himself was obsessed with Ibsen, having painted the author himself and having designed sets for Ibsen plays later in his career, though notably not A Doll's House. Secondly, Prince had used paintings as inspiration before, with the similarly Norwegian set Little Light Music taking inspiration from René Magritte. But Prince had never put Magritte's images directly on stage, as he would for A Doll's Life. But it would not just be paintings and dancers telling Nora's story. After auditioning hundreds of hopefuls, the team settled on Betsy Jocelyn as their Nora, a 29-year-old singer who had taken over the role of Joanna in Sweeney Todd, also directed by Hal Prince. She appears in the filmed version of the show.
Green finch and linnet bird, nightingale, blackbird, teach me how to sing!
Also from the replacement cast of Sweeney, George Hearn took the roles of both Torvald and Nora's newer suitor, Johan. Rounding out the leads as the industrialist Eric was opera singer turned actor Giorgio Tozzi, though he was replaced during rehearsals by a third Sweeney alum, original Judge Turpin actor Edmund Lindeck. So yes, this musical would feature a former Sweeney and former Judge Turpin serving as suitors to a former Joanna. The cast would also include Peter Gallagher as her third suitor, Otto. During rehearsals, Prince made it clear that he was uninterested in the musical becoming a political cudgel or a feminist screed, and stressed the universality of Ibsen's message. According to Prince, it isn't about a woman's rights any more than A Doll's House was. Ibsen didn't intend that. He intended it to be about people standing on their own feet. You hear that Nora can't operate her own business, that she can't have her own bank account, that she has no legal rights. Some of these things have changed, others not at all. What I like about A Doll's Life is that we don't have to force those issues on the audience. The mere fact that the story is being told causes those issues to be raised. But the mere fact of the story isn't all the production would focus on. The scenic design was both imposing and hugely abstract, featuring an enormous bridge that moved up and down, allowing two scenes to take place above and below each other. Choreographer Larry Fuller argued with Prince throughout the process, as his initial choreography for the Dance of Life quartet didn't quite fit the vision that Prince had in his head. Comden, Green, and Grossman completely rewrote the finale during rehearsals after an initial attempt to end the musical with Nora and Torvald reconciling was deemed unfitting, opting instead for a more ambiguous conclusion. Much of the process was reported by the writers Jeremy Gerard and Michiko Kakutani, who were invited to document rehearsals for the New York Times. For better or worse, it would turn out. Bankrolled by the Nederlanders, A Doll's Life was scheduled for a 12-week out-of-town tryout in Los Angeles, opening at the Amundsen Theater on June 15, 1982. The cast and crew felt good about the show, bolstered by positive response to their final New York rehearsals and supportive audiences during previews, which is partly why the team was so rattled when the reviews came back overwhelmingly negative. The question mark at the end of A Doll's House may be one of the reasons the play still intrigues us. What actually happened to Nora isn't as interesting to contemplate as the myriad of things that might have happened. In general, Prince's staging gives signals of importance that the text keeps revoking. The depth of the writing won't support the show's visual superstructure. In particular, critics framed the show as borrowing too much from Prince's former projects. The moving bridge from Sweeney, the tango dancers from Evita, the abstract scenic design from Night Music. On the writing side, they criticized Comden and Green's work for being too didactic and unlyrical, unlike the comic work they'd become famous for. And in general, mirrored Dan Sullivan's aforementioned view that the very concept of continuing Ibsen's story wasn't worth the effort. But with Prince's bolstering and a single good review from Daily Variety, the cast continued. After 5 weeks, Prince ceased making edits and left LA so the cast could settle into their roles, before returning 5 weeks later to close the LA tryout 2 weeks early. On September 8th, a newly confident team began previews at the Mark Hellinger Theater on Broadway, playing to sympathetic audiences until opening night on Thursday, September 23rd, 1982. And once again, the critics hated it. Among other things, Nora learns that sex can be fun, that women deserve equal rights and pay, that economic power is a political tool, that we're all human beings who can make choices. At this late date, these revelations are facts of life, but even so, A Doll's Life can't muster what should be a foolproof case for them. Worse still, A Doll's Life at times unintentionally parodizes or trivializes feminism, and misreads Ibsen's play by paradoxically arguing that most men are despicable, and that a woman's goal should be to act like a man. The closing notice was posted on Friday morning, and the show closed following the Sunday matinee. In total, A Doll's Life had played 18 previews and 5 performances on Broadway. And in order to explain the massive gap between artist confidence and audience response, I should probably recount the plot. Let's get one thing straight right away. I have never seen a production of A Doll's Life, and I'm going off the version of the script published by Samuel French in 1983. As you'll quickly notice, pacing is one of the show's biggest flaws, and I've had the opportunity to reread scenes that audiences watching wouldn't get. I definitely left things out in my original video and wrongly claimed that details were missing from the script. They're not missing so much as they are easy to miss. So, giving the show the benefit of overwhelming doubt, I'm going to recount the story the show wants to tell first, and then clarify how it tells it later. Also, credit to photographer Martha Swope in the New York City Library, who own the copyrights on all the production photos you're about to see. This is fair use, and I am not monetizing the video. Please don't destroy me. Okay, begin. Lights up on a modern-day rehearsal for A Doll's House. The actor playing Torvald, who is also the director, is giving notes on the final scene to the actress playing Nora. After rehearsing the final door slam, the set breaks away as Nora appears in full period attire for 1879, and the framing device fades away except for the ensemble who serve as Greek chorus. Nora, having just left her husband, gets on the first available train without buying a ticket, and uses her womanly charms to convince a fellow passenger, Otto, to pay for her. After doing so, she chastises herself, or rather the chorus chastises her, for falling back on her old tricks. She resolves to do better. Nora is hired as a waitress and quickly gets pulled into a drink with a table full of men who are celebrating another year in their respective loveless marriages. One of the men, a lawyer named Johan, takes a particular interest in Nora when she brings up a hypothetical about how much jail time a woman would face for forging a signature. But he leaves the restaurant and she's quickly fired for refusing the advances of the chef. Out of a job, Nora takes up with Otto, the guy from the train who just happens to also work at the restaurant as a musician, and she learns that he's a composer, working on a nationalist opera about Loki and Baldur. Otto mentions offhandedly that he has a friend who works for the opera as a dresser, so by the next scene, Nora has suddenly been hired as a dresser as well. She tries to pitch Otto's opera to the prima donna, Astrid, but gets nowhere until Johann shows up unexpectedly. It turns out he's Astrid's legal advisor, and at Nora's urging, he convinces her to at least give Otto's opera a private reading. In the next scene, Otto presents a segment of the opera for a largely disinterested crowd, but Astrid falls for the composer and agrees to develop the opera. Until she sees he's partnered with Nora, whereupon she drops the project completely. Otto, angry at Nora for jeopardizing his chances of success, lashes out at her, whereupon she immediately leaves him. Does it feel like we're moving too quickly? We're not even done with Act 1 yet. Nora gets hired offstage for her third job of the musical on an assembly line at a cannery with terrible work conditions. Within 7 pages of script, Nora reveals that she's been studying philosophy, then attempts to unionize the workers, then gets thrown in jail for protesting, then gets bailed out by Johann so he can take her as his date to the premiere of Otto's opera, which is now going into production, so I guess like a year has passed in the course of that sentence. It isn't clear. Anyway, it turns out that the real reason that Johann brought Nora is because the owner of the factory, an industrialist named Eric, is also at the opera that night, and Nora immediately lays into him for the poor working conditions. Eric agrees to discuss potential reforms to the factory if she'll go to bed with him. And she says yes? Cut to presumably another time skip, and Nora begins Act 2 singing about her newly liberated sexuality, in what is, to be fair, the second best song in the show.
Would have thought there's this wondrous invention, the body.
Nora accompanies Eric to a billiard game where she meets Johann again, who is now her financial advisor, but secretly so Eric won't know, and even more inexplicably meets Otto again, who Eric has hired as a waiter purely as a power move. When Eric steps away from his game of whist, he advises Nora to take over for him, leading to Otto and Johann and Eric all singing at once about how much they love Nora. Nora somehow manages to win at whist, leading to the first best song in the show, as she realizes that the power she feels in that moment is how men must feel all the time.
I love the taste of it, the sense of it. Power, power, it's man to man around a smoke-filled room. Bang, scissors, boom.
Eric, freaked out by this turn for Nora, cheats on her with a sex worker, which she immediately finds out about and then leaves him. Johann gets a letter from Nora to meet at a cafe where he presumes she will confess her feelings for him, but instead she uses him to sign loan papers so she can set up her own perfume business, alongside her business partner, the woman that Eric cheated on her with. And yes, I know that plot point is ridiculous, but also, that kicks ass. A few more time skips in the same scene later, and Nora is now running an internationally successful perfume business, and then, seemingly realizing in real time that she forgot to start dating Johann, starts dating Johann, only to have a sudden and unexplained pang of guilt about leaving her children. She goes to visit Torvald, learning that her children have been reading the letters she wrote to them, and the play ends with Torvald and Nora sitting down to finally talk. So it's not great. I want to jump back briefly and talk about that Prince quote about the message of the play being universal. It's true that Ibsen himself didn't identify as a feminist, once turning down an invitation to speak at a feminist conference. But he wasn't ignorant of the fact that the doll's life that Nora was breaking free of was a societal one, and not just her life with Torvald. Hattie Morahan, who played Nora in a 2012 Young Vic revival of the play, expressed a similar sentiment. There is something timeless about it. It ceases to be about a particular milieu and becomes about marriage, or partnership, and money. These are universal anxieties, and it seems from talking to people that it resonates in the most visceral way, especially if they are, or have been, in a difficult relationship. That said, there's a weight to the 19th century setting of A Doll's House that's divorced from the dramaturgical fact of it having been written then. And it's expressed by, of all people, the fictional director at the beginning of A Doll's Life. The part of Nora was written 100 years ago. You're playing it with the knowledge of everything that's happened to men and women since then. Nora is not stepping around the corner to buy a pack of cigarettes. She is stepping off a cliff in the dark. What's important to know about Nora is that Ibsen's characterization of her is hugely variable between productions and between actresses. It's a fair read of the script to see Nora as already harboring resentment to Torvald at the start. Jane Fonda leans in that direction in her 1973 film adaptation. It's equally valid to play Nora as genuinely loving towards Torvald, and therefore more betrayed when he turns on her. Janet McTeer played her that way in the 1997 Broadway revival. All we can know for certain about Nora, in the abstract of the script and outside of production, are her actions, from eating macaroons to slamming the door. And that variability is exciting, and part of what has kept the play timely over its 144-year production history. But in order to determine what Nora's next actions would be, what an immediate sequel to Ibsen's play would look like, you need to have your characterization of Nora already established. You need to have already decided why she acts the way she does. It's clear in reading about A Doll's Life that they wanted to veer in the direction of McTeer's characterization of a younger and more naive Nora. The choice to cast a younger ingenue implies a character still determining her sense of personhood, still prone to making errors and trusting quickly, someone who walks out the door not knowing how to build the life she wants. Honestly, the moment when she uses her old tactics in order to guilt Otto into paying her train fare, and then criticizes herself for doing so, is a perfectly supported action for Nora to take. But as the script continues, it gets harder to retain a consistent characterization of Nora. This is a woman who, again, going by the actions of the script, gets arrested for unionizing the workers at a cannery, and 2 scenes later ends up sleeping with the owner of that cannery. She sings about wanting the confidence that power gives to men, and 2 pages of script later is sobbing openly because her capitalist boyfriend no longer loves her. Now, before I get much further, I want to voice that having Nora waver between different modes of womanhood is honestly not a bad idea for this musical. This is someone who is trying to build a new version of herself from a blank slate, so some inconsistency in how she approaches the world, either like a naive waif or a Reaganite girl boss, is expected. Dramatically potent, even, as her inconsistent actions showcase an evolving mindset. But this is where we need to bring up the issue of pace again, because aside from 3 ballads Nora has, in between scenes and performed alone, there's very little time given for Nora to reflect on the direction her life is heading. This is a musical where a lot of things happen, but very few things lead into each other. Nora has 4 jobs over the course of this musical, and in all 4 cases, she's hired off stage. Only her turn as an opera dresser is given any amount of setup, and that setup is a single line from Otto buried in a scene where it isn't the focus. Much of what Nora does is in response to things happening to her, not actions she is taking of her own accord. When I said earlier that my synopsis was the story the musical wants to have, this is what I was referring to. If you manage to clock every single line of dialogue and throw your focus to exactly where the show wants it to be at every moment, the plot of A Doll's Life does make some kind of sense. But in production, when you don't have the chance to go back and reread things, I can imagine that the audience might get lost. Like, for a comparison, remember that moment in Les Mis where Jean Valjean is set free by the bishop and vows to make a new life for himself, and then 5 minutes later we've jumped forward 8 years and Valjean is now the mayor? It's a lot to take in, but the script gives it proper focus. The music slows down, Valjean imparts the relevant information quickly, and most importantly, the question of how he got there doesn't matter to the immediate scene. The new info is established, and we move on. A Doll's Life is what would happen if Valjean started every scene with a new job and the script never clarified how much time had passed. If you have to keep recalibrating where we are and what the character wants, it's hard to keep your focus on the message the play is allegedly imparting. And this lack of focus compounds when you factor in the abstract scenic design and the quartet of ghostly dancers and the modern framing device. So much theory that makes sense if you know exactly where to look, but leads to confusion for the viewer, which, in brief, is where the huge gap in perception between the cast and the audience came from. When you're creating the painting, each brushstroke might make sense, but the audience is looking at the whole picture, and the impression from the outside was a jumbled mess. That's my impression on why the failure of A Doll's Life was so unexpected by those that worked on it. But the fact that it bombed shouldn't be taken as evidence that the show is beyond repair. Hal Prince, writing about the show years later, said, "There's a temptation when you work on a flop not only to criticize the material, but also to find a reason for its failure with the critics and the public. In this case, I was certain that at that time feminism was a controversial subject and the critics took issue with it." Even in his later life, when the show became just one of a string of flops, Prince still insisted that the musical had been a victim of the conservative time period.
I believe it was also ahead of its time and pretty terrific. Socially, we weren't ready for that kind of material and that message.
Do I agree with Hal Prince on this point? Well, yes and no. I agree with him that the time period when A Doll's Life was written is the main culprit for its failure, but I disagree that the musical failed because the audience wasn't ready. At the top of this video, I said the musical was ahead of its time. Typically, that's a phrase that means that the material of the show was too progressive or forward-thinking for audiences or critics to appreciate. That would match Prince's analysis and would make the musical a prime candidate for revisiting with a modern viewpoint. But when I say it's ahead of its time, what I really mean is that the ideas the writers wanted to espouse are more progressive than the script they wrote to express them. Take the song Power as an example. Nora expresses her desire for agency of the same kind that men have, with a particular monetary bent. She wants to be independent, and for the time period, that is to say the 1980s, that meant financial independence. So she spends the second half of Act 2 establishing herself, at a blistering pace, as a successful perfume magnate. Then, in a climactic moment that is given adequate focus, Nora briefly considers reducing production costs by cutting the wages of her workers, before realizing that she's doing exactly what Eric did at the cannery. There's huge potential in this moment for Nora to realize that her model of being liberated is still rooted in emulating the actions of men, of keeping other people down in order to pull herself up. She even has a line recognizing this catch-22. "I ran away from a doll's world, and I have become an independent woman by telling other women how to stay in a doll's world." The tools were right there. But the 1982 cultural conversation around feminism was still rooted in the idea of women can do anything a man can do, even capitalism. So, rather than self-reflection, Nora wriggles out of her ethical quandary by basically inventing collective shareholding, and the musical continues to treat her financial independence as equitable to sociocultural independence. This is a through line in the show. Eric mentions that the workplace reforms that Nora slept with him to obtain have been successful, not because they improved the lives of the women, but for the utilitarian reason that it boosted output at the factory. Nora succeeds in getting Astra to produce a reading of Otto's play, but only because Johann is infatuated with her and happens to be there to make the argument better than she could. The feminist message, as much as the play has one, is really mixed. But a question then. If the musical wasn't ready to have those conversations in 1982, can the script still serve their purpose of having those conversations now? Remember, Nora is still figuring out who she wants to be, so some hypocrisy and backtracking regarding how she builds an identity is understandable. Would a modern audience find this material contradictory in a way that intrigues rather than deters? Surprisingly, yes, I think it can, but it's more nuanced than just overhauling the book with today's talking points. I think the salvage effort on A Doll's Life, if we choose to undertake it, is a little of column rewrite and a little of column production. On the rewrites side of things, the main goal should be to simplify and to keep the show's focus on Nora. Gut the modern day opening and let her letters to her children serve as the framing device for her to reflect, to herself, on how her journey to liberation is going. She can make mistakes and be contradictory in her actions, so long as we see those actions as successive steps on the path to becoming an autonomous person. Small adjustments can also give Nora more agency, having the play driven by her own actions rather than those of the men around her. Eric promising Nora labor reforms as a way to pressure her into bed is gross and weird, but Nora seducing Eric as a manner of winning labor reforms, particularly after telling herself not to fall back on old tricks, is a much more dynamic and emotionally loaded choice. The score, on the whole, is the one element of the show that evaded harsh criticism in the 1982 reviews. All it needs is some lighter orchestration, some smaller adjustments to Comden and Green's rougher lyrics, and the trimming down of a few songs. In particular, songs that could be cut down include A Woman Alone, Loki and Baldur, There She Is, The Grand Cafe, and New Year's Eve. You could probably cut the whole of New Year's Eve, to be honest. Johann's solo number, You Interest Me, is a better introduction to the character. And finally, assure that Nora's motives for the actions she undertakes are clear to the audience. It's stated in the current script that her return to Torvald at the end is to hash out custody of the children, not to restart her relationship with him. But that statement is in one line during a transition before she goes back. It should have greater prominence in production. Which brings us to production. As with the writing, simplify. You don't need Edvard Munch dancers in a floating bridge. You need an actress playing Nora that can handle the transition between the characters' moments of high confidence and self-loathing. Take a page from more modern shows like Come From Away or Hadestown that keep a sprightly pace while still assuring, through intentional, clean blocking, that the audience focus remains where it needs to be at all times. And bring down the scale of the production so it resembles more a tone poem than a grand opera. As Prince said during rehearsals, he was uninterested in the musical becoming a lecture. It has to be, like Ibsen's script before it, first and foremost the story of a woman. The funny thing is, these notes aren't just theoretical. The only major revival of A Doll's Life at the off-Broadway York Theatre Company in 1994 made many of those adjustments. No framing device, simplified orchestrations, keep the focus on Nora. And the reviews for that production were, well, they were also mixed, but I think it was a step in the right direction. The truth is, as I was reading the script again, I would occasionally read a line or a lyric and have the thought, is this musical secretly good? I think after looking at it more critically, no, it still has too many flaws for me to recommend it unconditionally. But I'm happy to recommend it conditionally. There are too many nuggets of possibility here to write it off as just another Broadway flop. It's too earnest for that. It's too genuine in what it tries and fails to do. Ultimately, if you want to know why A Doll's Life failed, it's because it was, like Nora herself, caught between two different worlds and trying to live in both at once. It wanted to communicate a third-wave feminist message, but it only had second-wave feminist language to work with. Perhaps now, living in a fourth-wave feminist world, we can finally tell Nora's story with the clarity of language that it deserves. Perhaps we can give this musical a chance to live a new life of its own.